I heard my daughter-in-law whisper, "Don't open the door," while I was still standing on my son's porch, holding a warm apple pie like a fool who still believed she was welcome. If you've ever loved someone more than they loved you back, stay with me until the end. And tell me where you're watching from. I'd like to know how far this story travels. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn as I stood there, frozen. The wind slipped through my cardigan, cold enough to make me shiver, but not nearly as cold as the words I had just heard through that door. For a moment, I told myself I must have misunderstood. I had driven 40 minutes across town to get there. Daniel had sounded tired on the phone the night before. Quiet in that way he used to be when he was little and trying to pretend he was okay. A mother recognizes those things. We don't forget them no matter how old our children get. So I did what I had always done. I baked apple pie just the way he loved it. Extra cinnamon. A pinch of nutmeg. The smell had filled my kitchen that morning, wrapping around me like something familiar. Something safe. I remember thinking, he'll smile when he tastes this. Because in my mind I was still his mother. And mothers don't need invitations. Then I heard her again. "Brittany." Lower this time. Sharper. "Not now." My hand hovered inches from the door. I didn't knock. I didn't move. I just stood there listening to the silence that followed. The kind of silence that says more than words ever could. And slowly, so slowly I could feel it happening, my smile faded. I don't remember walking back to my car. I don't remember starting the engine. But I remember the drive home feeling longer than 40 minutes. The streets looked the same. The houses, the traffic lights, the familiar turns. I had driven that route 100 times before. But something had shifted. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than I needed to, and told myself all the things people say to make uncomfortable truths easier to swallow. They need space. Young couples are different these days. You shouldn't just show up unannounced. I had said those same words to other women over coffee after church, nodding like I understood how families changed over time. But sitting there at a red light staring straight ahead, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This didn't feel like space. This felt like a door that had already been closed long before I ever knocked. The next morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I stopped defending them, in my own mind. For so long that had been my quiet habit. Before anyone could explain themselves, before I even had all the facts, I would soften things, smooth them over, turn sharp edges into something harmless. Daniel is busy. Brittany is under pressure. Life is complicated. There was always a reason. Always a gentler version of the truth I could choose, if I wanted peace badly enough. But peace built on pretending is just another kind of loneliness. And I was getting tired of both. I stood in my kitchen that morning, staring at the same counter where I had rolled out the pie crust the day before. The dish was still sitting there, empty now, except for a thin smear of cinnamon along the edge. I hadn't even realized I brought it back inside. I made breakfast out of habit. 2 eggs. Wheat toast. Coffee. I didn't taste any of it. The coffee sat in my hands longer than it should have, growing lukewarm as I stood by the sink. Outside the window the sky was a dull gray. The kind of early spring morning that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be winter or not. The trees were still bare, their branches thin and exposed, nothing to hide behind. I understood that feeling. For years I had wrapped my life around my family. Around Daniel. Around the belief that if I gave enough, showed up enough, loved steadily and quietly, I would always have a place in his world. Not the center of it. I knew better than that. But at least a place. And yet, standing on that porch the day before, I hadn't felt like a mother dropping by. I had felt like a problem being kept outside. I replayed the moment again, this time without rushing to excuse it. The tone in Brittany's voice. The urgency. Not surprise. Not inconvenience. Avoidance. That was the word that settled in my chest, heavy and undeniable. She hadn't said, "Give me a minute." She hadn't said, "We're not ready." She said, "Don't open the door." As if I were something that needed to be kept out. I set my cup down carefully, my fingers suddenly unsteady. It's a strange thing, realizing you've been slowly erased from a life you thought you were still part of. There's no single moment where it happens. No announcement. No clean break. Just small shifts. Missed calls that aren't returned. Visits that become less frequent. Conversations that feel edited. And then one day you find yourself standing outside a door, hearing someone decide whether or not you're allowed in. I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked around my kitchen. Everything was in its place. The same curtains, the same table, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator. Nothing had changed. Except me. For the first time I wasn't asking, what did I do wrong? I was asking something else. Something sharper. When did they decide I no longer belonged? I didn't go back to Daniel's house that week. Not the next day. Not even the day after that. Instead, I stayed home. And for the first time in a long while, I started paying attention to the things I had been ignoring. The silence, for one. My phone used to ring more often. Not constantly, but enough. A quick check-in. A short conversation. Sometimes just Daniel asking about a recipe or how to fix something around the house. Now nothing. I told myself it was normal. Grown children have their own lives, their own routines, their own priorities. But as the days passed, I noticed something else. It wasn't just that he wasn't calling. He wasn't returning my calls either. I had left a message that first evening after I got home. Nothing dramatic. Just a light tone. Hey honey, I stopped by earlier. Must have missed you. Call me when you get a chance. He never did. By the third day, I stopped checking my phone every hour. By the fourth, I stopped carrying it from room to room. I left it on the kitchen counter, screen down, as if not looking at it might somehow make the silence feel less intentional. It didn't. That Thursday, I drove to the grocery store like I always did. Same list. Same aisles. Same quiet routine I had followed for years. But even there, something felt different. I ran into Carol from church near the produce section. She smiled warmly. The way people do when they recognize you but don't quite know what's been happening in your life. Oh, I saw Daniel and Brittany last weekend, she said casually, picking up a bundle of green onions. They looked lovely. My hand paused over a basket of apples. Last weekend? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Yes, she nodded. At that new cafe on Maple. They were with another couple. Seemed like a double date. I smiled. Of course I did. Well, that's nice, I said. We chatted for another minute or two. About the weather, about the upcoming church event. And then we went our separate ways. But I didn't pick up any apples. I just stood there, staring at the display, feeling something quiet and heavy settle into place. Last weekend. The same weekend I had stood on their porch holding that pie. They hadn't been busy. They hadn't been overwhelmed. They had simply chosen not to open the door. I finished my shopping without really remembering what I put in my cart. The cashier spoke to me. I'm sure she did. But her words blurred into the background as I nodded and handed over my card. Back in my car, I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, hands resting in my lap, and let the truth settle in without rushing to soften it. This wasn't distance. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't even neglect. It was deliberate. A quiet, careful kind of exclusion. The kind that doesn't leave visible marks but changes everything all the same. And for the first time, I didn't ask myself how to fix it. I asked something else. If they could go out, laugh, sit across from friends, and live their lives as if I didn't exist, then what exactly had I been holding on to all this time? The answer came slow and unwelcome. Not them. Just the idea of them. That afternoon, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I didn't try to fill the silence. Instead, I sat by the window in my living room, the same spot where I used to wait for Daniel to come home from school all those years ago. Back when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway meant something. Back when I was expected. I let my mind drift, not forcing anything this time. And slowly memories began to surface. Not the warm ones I usually held on to, but the ones I had quietly pushed aside. The ones that didn't fit the story I preferred to believe. Like the time Brittany insisted they host Thanksgiving, and then told me the wrong time. I had arrived early, or so I thought, only to find everyone already halfway through dinner. Plates half empty. Conversations already flowing. Oh, we didn't think you'd mind, she had said with a polite smile. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. Or Christmas the year before that. Daniel had called to say they wanted something small. Just the two of them this year. I understood. I said I did. Later I saw the photos online. A full table. Laughter. friends, her family, everyone but me. I had sat in this very chair that night, eating reheated leftovers, telling myself it wasn't personal. But now, looking back, I saw the pattern clearly. It was never loud, never confrontational, just quiet adjustments, small exclusions, slight changes, carefully placed distances. And each time I had adjusted myself to fit around them, I made myself smaller, more understanding, less demanding, easier to leave out. I leaned back in the chair, my hands folded loosely in my lap, and exhaled slowly. It's a strange kind of realization, when the pain isn't new, just finally understood. Because the truth was, that moment on the porch hadn't been the beginning. It had been the confirmation. A line I hadn't seen before, now impossible to ignore. I wasn't being slowly pushed away anymore. I had already been placed outside. And somehow, without noticing, I had been standing there for a long time. That evening I did something small, but it felt different. I didn't call Daniel. Not to check in. Not to casually mention anything. Not to give him an easy way to explain what I had already begun to understand. Instead, I made dinner for one. Grilled chicken. Steamed vegetables. A slice of bread I didn't really want but added out of habit. I set the table the way I always did, plate centered, fork to the left, glass just above the knife. For years I had kept two settings. Even when it was just me. A quiet gesture. A kind of hope. Tonight I didn't. I sat down, folded my hands for a moment, and then started eating. No television. No background noise. Just the soft clink of silverware against the plate and the steady rhythm of chewing. It should have felt lonely, but it didn't. Felt clear. After dinner I washed the dishes slowly, drying each one before placing it back in the cabinet. There was something calming about the routine, something grounding in the predictability of it. Unlike people, dishes didn't change. They didn't shift their place in your life without warning. They stayed where you put them. I wiped down the counter, then paused. My phone was still sitting there, exactly where I had left it earlier that morning. Face down. Silent. For a moment I considered picking it up. Just to check. Just in case. But I didn't. Because deep down I already knew what I would find. Nothing. And for the first time that realization didn't send me searching for excuses. Settled over me like something final. I walked into the living room and sat down, the house quiet around me. The kind of quiet that used to feel heavy, but now felt honest. No pretending. No waiting. Just truth. I thought about all the years I had spent adjusting myself to keep the peace. Biting back questions. Ignoring discomfort. Rewriting moments in my head so they hurt less than they actually did. I had called it patience. I had called it love. But sitting there now I saw it differently. It had also been permission. Permission for them to treat me like I would always understand. Always forgive. Always stay. No matter what. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment, letting that thought settle fully. Because if I had allowed it, then I could also choose to stop. That was the part no one talks about. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when something inside you shifts. Not into anger. Not into revenge. Just into clarity. You stop asking for space in places where you're no longer offered one. You stop knocking on doors that have already been closed. And maybe most importantly, you stop waiting to be invited into a life that has quietly moved on without you. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. The same furniture, the same photographs, the same life I had built piece by piece over decades. Nothing had changed. Except this, I was no longer confused. And somehow that made all the difference. The next morning I didn't wake up with the same heaviness. That surprised me. For days, maybe even longer than I wanted to admit, I had been carrying something I couldn't quite name. Not just sadness. Not just confusion. Something heavier. But that morning it felt lighter. Not better. Just clearer. I moved through my routine without rushing. Made my bed. Opened the curtains. Let the pale morning light fill the room. It wasn't warm yet. Spring was still undecided, but it was enough. Enough to see things as they were. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. Not by the sink this time. I didn't stand. I didn't distract myself with chores. I just sat. And I thought about Daniel. Not the version of him I had been holding on to. The little boy with scraped knees who used to run to me for comfort. Not the teenager who needed advice about school or life, or the girl he was too nervous to call. I thought about the man he had become, a man who heard his wife say, "Don't open the door," and didn't open it. That realization didn't hit me like a wave. It settled quietly. Because the truth is, Brittany may have said the words, but Daniel allowed them to stand. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, letting the warmth sink into my fingers. For years, I had placed the distance between us on circumstance, on marriage, on life getting busy. But distance doesn't happen without agreement. And silence is a kind of agreement too. I had been waiting for him to notice, to call, to explain. But what if he already had? Not with words, with actions. I exhaled slowly, my gaze drifting to the small calendar hanging on the wall. Birthdays marked in blue ink. Appointments in black. Little notes I had written to myself so I wouldn't forget things that mattered. I realized something then. I had kept track of everyone else's life. But no one had been keeping track of mine. No one had circled my days. No one had made space for me. And yet I had kept showing up. I stood up from the table and walked over to the counter, picking up my phone for the first time that morning. The screen lit up instantly. No missed calls. No messages. Just the date, the time, and a quiet kind of confirmation. I didn't feel the urge to dial his number. That was new too. Instead, I opened my contacts, hovered over his name for a moment, then gently pressed edit. I didn't delete it. Not yet. But I did something else. I removed the little heart I had placed next to his name years ago. A small thing, almost meaningless to anyone else. But to me it felt like telling the truth. Not about him. About me. About the version of myself that had been holding on long after there was something left to hold. I set the phone back down and looked around my kitchen again. Same walls. Same table. Same quiet. But this time it didn't feel like something I needed to escape. It felt like something I could finally stand in without pretending. And for the first time, a different question began to form in my mind. Not why did they do this? But what do I do now, that I finally see it clearly? I didn't answer that question right away. What do I do now? For most of my life, the answer had always been simple. You stay. You adjust. You forgive. That's what mothers do. We bend without breaking. We make room even when no one asks us to. We keep the door open, even when no one walks through it. But standing there in my kitchen, something about that answer no longer felt right. Not wrong, just incomplete. Because staying only works when there's something left to stay for. I spent the rest of that morning going through small things I had put off for weeks. Laundry. Sorting through a drawer that had quietly become a place for everything I didn't want to deal with. Old receipts. Rubber bands. A birthday card from 2 years ago I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Daniel's handwriting was still on the envelope. Love you, Mom. I held it for a moment longer than necessary, then set it aside. Not in the keep pile. Not in the throw away pile either. Just aside. That seemed to be where a lot of things in my life belonged now. By early afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet. The one I rarely opened unless I needed something specific. Inside, tucked neatly on the top shelf, was a box I hadn't touched in years. Pulled it down carefully and set it on the table. Inside were old photos. Daniel as a baby, wrapped in a soft blue blanket. His first day of school, backpack too big for his shoulders. A picture of the two of us at the beach, him laughing, me holding his hand like I'd never let go. I sat down and looked through them slowly. Not with longing. Not with regret. Just with honesty. Because those moments were real. They mattered. But they were also over. And somewhere along the way, I had been living as if they still defined who we were now. As if love once given stayed unchanged forever. But people change. Relationships change. And sometimes they end quietly without anyone saying the words out loud. I closed the box gently and rested my hands on top of it. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had been avoiding. Maybe my role in Daniel's life had already changed. Not because I had done something wrong. Not because I had failed as a mother. But simply because he had chosen a different center for his world. And I was no longer part of it. That truth didn't break me. It steadied me. Because if I was no longer needed in the way I used to be, Then I was no longer required to keep giving in the same way either. I stood up, carried the box back to the closet, and placed it gently on the shelf. Not hidden, just where it belonged. When I closed the door, I didn't feel like I was shutting something away. I felt like I was making space for something new. I just didn't know what that something was yet. But for the first time, I was ready to find out. That evening, I didn't sit in the living room. I didn't turn on the lights right away either. Instead, I found myself standing by the front door, my hand resting lightly against it, almost without thinking. The same door I had walked through thousands of times. The same door I had always left unlocked just in case. Just in case Daniel stopped by. Just in case someone needed me. I used to take comfort in that. The idea that I was available, needed, expected. But now, standing there in the dim light, I saw it differently. A door can stay open for years, and still no one chooses to walk through it. I reached for the lock. My fingers hesitated for just a second, not because I wasn't sure, but because I understood what it meant. Then I turned it. A soft click. Quiet. Final. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just intentional. I stepped back, looking at the door for a moment longer than necessary. It looked exactly the same. Nothing about it had changed. But something inside me had. I walked into the living room and turned on a single lamp. The warm light filled the space slowly, touching the edges of familiar furniture, casting soft shadows across the walls. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a place I was waiting in. It felt like a place I was living in. I sat down on the couch and picked up a book I had tried to read weeks ago. Back then I couldn't focus. My mind had been too busy, circling the same thoughts, the same questions, the same quiet disappointments I refused to name. Tonight I read 3 pages without stopping. Then 5. Then 10. Not because the story was extraordinary, but because my mind was still. No checking my phone. No listening for a call that wasn't coming. No rehearsing conversations that would never happen. Just silence. And for once it didn't feel like something was missing. It felt like something had been returned. Later I stood up and walked past the hallway mirror. I caught my reflection for a brief second. I looked the same. Same lines. Same silver in my hair. Same familiar face I had seen every day for years. But my eyes, they were different. Not softer. Not sadder. Clearer. As if something had finally settled into place behind them. I didn't look like someone waiting anymore. I looked like someone who had stepped back. And that realization stayed with me as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. Because for the first time, I wasn't ending the day wondering if tomorrow would be different. I already knew it would be. Not because they would change, but because I had. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. Not because I had to, but because something inside me felt ready. For so long, my days had started the same way. Quietly reaching for my phone, checking for messages that never came, holding on to the smallest hope that today might be different. That morning, I didn't reach for anything. I simply sat up, placed my feet on the floor and took a slow breath. The house was still, but it no longer felt empty. It felt mine. I made my coffee and carried it out to the front porch. The air was cool, fresh in a way that made everything feel just a little sharper. The street was quiet, the world not fully awake yet. I sat down and looked out at the same view I had seen for years. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about Daniel. Not about whether he would call. Not about what I might say if he did. I wasn't replaying conversations. I wasn't rewriting memories. I wasn't searching for reasons. I was just there. Present. And that was when I understood something I hadn't been able to see before. Closure doesn't always come from the people who hurt you. Sometimes, it comes from the moment you stop needing them to explain. I took a sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Daniel might call one day. He might show up at my door, holding an explanation, an apology, or maybe just silence wrapped in regret. And if that day comes, I'll open the door. But not because I've been waiting. And not because I need him to. Only because I choose to. That was the difference now. Choice. Not obligation. Not habit. Not hope built on old versions of love. Just choice. I stood up after a while and stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind me. The same door I had once kept open for everyone else. Now it opened for me. I walked through the house slowly, not searching for anything, just noticing. The sunlight beginning to spill across the floor. The quiet hum of a life that was still mine to live. The space that no longer felt like something I had to fill, but something I could shape. For years, I had believed that being a good mother meant holding on. Holding on through distance. Through silence. Through the slow, quiet ways love can change when you're not looking. But no one ever teaches you the other part. That sometimes being strong means letting go. Not in anger. Not in bitterness. But in truth. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror again, just like the night before. And this time I didn't look for what had changed. I already knew. I wasn't the woman standing on that porch anymore, holding a pie waiting to be let in. I was the woman who had walked away, who had seen the door for what it was, and who had finally understood. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. They're meant to show you where you no longer belong so you can find the place where you finally do. Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories.